I am Samantha Wexler. I'm the Executive Director of Culture Reframed, and I have the pleasure once again of introducing Dr. Gail Dines, who I have the privilege of working very closely with, and I know that she doesn't need any introduction, but Dr. Gail Dines has been researching and writing about the harms of pornography for over 30 years. She is a recipient of the Myers Center Award for the Study of Human Rights in North America, and she's the author of numerous books and articles, including one that I suspect many of you have read called Pornland: How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality. Pornland has been translated into 5 languages. Dr. Dines is the founder and president of the nonprofit organization Culture Reframed, which is hosting this entire conference. It's dedicated to building resilience and resistance in children and youth to the harms of hypersexualized media and pornography. She has worked with organizations such as the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Centers for Disease Control, the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals, as well as government bodies in the US, Brazil, UK, Sweden, Iceland, Norway, Colombia, and Canada, and so much more. If you haven't read her biography on the website, I encourage you to do that. And I think you're in for a real treat for the next half hour. Gail?
Thank you. Right, so what I'm going to be talking about is what has happened to feminism. So how did we go from understanding that porn is a form of violence against women to porn as a form of empowerment? So the bizarre thing here is, as porn becomes more mainstream feminism becomes more pornified, which is, of course, exactly what we don't need, given the problems we're facing and the issues with the porn industry. So again, the question is, how did we move from porn equals male violence against women to actually this notion that somehow it's liberating and it's empowering? So I want to remind some of you of what feminism looked like in the second wave. And this is a quote from Barbara Smith from a book called This Bridge Called My Back, which was really important because it was the first ever collection of African American, well, of actually women of color to contribute to the second wave feminism. And although this had been going on for many years, this was the book that really did launch an understanding of how we have to integrate an analysis of racism into radical feminism. So feminism is the political theory and practice to free all women, women of color, working class women, poor women, physically challenged women, as well as white, economically privileged heterosexual women. Anything less than this is not feminism. So notice, nowhere here are you seeing the word empowerment. So what you're seeing here is a notion of liberation, not empowerment. And who to put it better than Andrea Dworkin, which is the notion that women exist as a subordinate sex class. And she wrote, the fate of every individual woman, no matter what her politics, character, values, qualities, is tied to the fate of all women, whether she likes it or not. This is what, again, it meant to talk about sisterhood and what liberation meant. We are all in this together. So again, going back to Andrea Dworkin, who really was one of the first to conceptualize what pornography is from a feminist perspective. So she said, think about pornography as social control, a democratic use of terrorism against all women, a way of saying to every woman, when you look up bitch, you're going to see your legs spread. So the critical part about this is that pornography is about the women in pornography and how they are degraded and debased, and how this has an effect on all women in the culture. Because when you debase and degrade one woman, you debase and degrade all women. But I want to make it very clear that women in pornography definitely come out with the worst of it. So we had some wonderful books. We had Pornography by Andrea Dworkin, Pornography and Silence, Not for Sale, Take Back the Night. This was kind of the heyday of anti-porn feminism. And I remember sort of coming of age in this time and really being seeped into this theory and activism, because in radical feminism, you never separate theory from activism. The two have to work together. And then we went down a rabbit hole, a serious rabbit hole. We started getting books from feminists called things like Bound and Gagged, Hardcore by Linda Williams, and then Defending Pornography by Nadine Strossen, which of all of them, I think Defending Pornography is probably the most vicious takedown of specifically Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon. And Nadine Strossen, by the way, was president of the ACLU at the time of writing this book. So now we go down even a worse rabbit hole. So we get to a book called The Feminist Porn Book. Now, I never thought I would live long enough to see all of those words put together. The Feminist Porn Book. I mean, it kind of gives you a headache just thinking about it. Now, I want to read you an Amazon review of the book. The Feminist Porn Book identifies the importance of pornography as a form of expression and labor in which women and other minorities produce power and pleasure. Now, I like to think of myself as a somewhat educated person. Can anyone make any sense of this? What the hell does it mean? I have no clue, because actually, if you're creating pleasure for anyone, it's for the users. And the notion that it is an expression of labor, as opposed to a form of sexual slavery, which is what the sex industry is, just to me boggles the mind that this is how far down the rabbit hole we've gone. So I want to be very clear that what feminist porn and ethical porn are marketing ploys. They're developed by the mainstream industry to target, quote, the woke class, so that they can have a somewhat, specifically the men, a guilt-free use of porn because they're woke, and of course they wouldn't do anything that oppresses any group. And so we now have feminist porn and ethical porn. And again, I have no idea what those means, because you cannot make a product based on the sexual violence of women feminist or ethical. It is too bankrupt at its core to talk about harm reduction, to talk about making it ethical. It is absolutely impossible, given that the nature of pornography is to debase women, and the more you do that, the greater the sizzle. Now, what we've seen is that a structural view of pornography affecting all women, which was how Andrea Dworkin put it, is replaced by an individualistic neoliberal view of women expressing themselves. So we've gone from a systemic understanding of women as a subordinate sex class to a neoliberal view where women are just individuals with lots and lots of choices, making lots of empowerment decisions, etc. Now, this move is really part of a larger shift away from radical feminism to what is neoliberal feminism. And that took place during the Reagan-Thatcher years. So I really do put the blame on these two. And remember, a lot of young feminists today, and indeed those going into the academy, they grew up within this time. This is all they had in the air. And why neoliberalism was originally an economic theory developed specifically out of the Chicago School and Milton Friedman, it comes with an attendant ideology about how the world works. And so what happened is that neoliberal economics gave birth to an ideology which then attached itself to a lot of often young people who were brought up to think about people in terms of individuals and not as a collective. So Margaret Thatcher, in her usual succinct way, said there's no such thing as society. There are individuals, men and women. Well, we know that's ridiculous, okay? That's not how the world works. And actually, in the middle of a global pandemic, if we've ever had to face the notion that there is no such things as individuals, but a collective called society, it's right now. So this is Margaret Thatcher. Just want you to think about this. No such thing as society, just individual men and women. Now, this is from the manifesto from Third Wave Feminism on Alternet, which is, by the way, a progressive site. And it says feminism is something individual to each feminist. Well, sorry, but it doesn't work like that. When you're building a movement, you have to have an agreed upon set of assumptions, an agreed upon set of how you're going to go and change the world through activism. Think of any other movement. Think of saying the civil rights movement is something individual to each person of color. Where would we have gotten with that? Or the labor movement is something individual to each worker. No movement, by definition, is based on an individual meaning of it. It is based on what those people in the movement collectively through theory and practice develop as the core assumptions. Now, in neoliberalism, there is no such thing as structural inequality. There's no systems of oppression. There's no groups with collective interests that includes the oppressed class and the oppressor class. There's just lots of individuals making lots of individual choices with lots of self-empowerment. Well, in fact, this is the image that those in power give. They want us to think we're just individuals, because the most dangerous thing to people in power is that we understand, those of us who are oppressed, our collective interests. Now those with the oppressor class, do understand their collective interests. They meet regularly around the world, in Davos, for example, and when they're meeting there, what do you think they're talking about? What they had for dinner last night? No, they are operating as a collective class, deciding collectively on what the economics and what strategies they're going to put in place for the coming year. So this is a real joke on the oppressed to say, you know, don't worry, you're just an individual, because they know full well that we're not just individuals. So I want to bring this down to the concept of, quote, sex work. So sex work is, and this is a quote, by the way, from the Open Society, so people shouldn't be surprised, sex work is a consensual transaction between adults where the act of selling or buying sexual service is not a violation of human rights. So let's look what's missing here. So first of all, it's a consensual transaction. Study after study, as well as survivor after survivor, tells us this is absolutely not consensual. You're talking about one group with power exploiting another group who are powerless. And then it's between adults. So no mention of the fact that actually what we're talking about is the buying and selling of women's bodies by men. So we've completely desexualized all of this in terms of sex class oppression and just said it's adults, where the act of selling or buying sexual services, again, not the act of buying or selling a woman, is not a violation of human rights. Why is it not a violation of human rights? Because it's about women, and women are not considered fully human in patriarchy. So if you're not fully human, you can't really violate your rights, your human rights, because you don't really have any. So I want to argue and discuss why porn and prostitution are not considered violence against women because, quote, women consent. And how many of you out there are just so sick of the term consent, 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 as if it has any real meaning in a patriarchal, pornographic society? So what we need to do is, quote, unpack what is consent in this culture. So what we know is that women consent under conditions of opportunity and constraint. So what I might consent to, given my life circumstances, could be very different from the woman over there who is working 2 jobs to put food on the table. Now, I want to talk about intersectionality here, and interestingly, I saw a lot of discussion in the chat before. Now, intersectionality, as used by second-wave feminists, is a political theory to capture the complex ways that material, not ideological, that material inequalities intersect to constrain women's access to material resources. This is a structural understanding of how women experience the world, differentiated by race and class privileges. The fact that this has been hijacked by third-wave feminism into an issue of identity politics does not and should not take away the power of an intersectional analysis that is based on understanding the materiality of women's lives. Because in the end, this is what it's all about, access to resources. So what are the constraints under which women choose the sex industry? Well, we know, again, from survivors and from research, that these constraints are poverty, racism, histories of sexual abuse, histories of substance abuse. And if you don't have a substance abuse problem before you go into the porn industry, there's a very good chance you're going to get one. And a lot of the people I interview in the porn industry who anonymously do interviews with me tell me there's actually doctors on the set handing out opioids so that the women can get through what's happening to them. And certainly if I was on the set doing that, I would need a ton of stuff to get me through that. That women are being pimped out, right? So we have to not talk about prostitutes as much as prostituted women. They always say that prostitution is the oldest profession. Ridiculous. First of all, it's not a profession, it's sexual exploitation. And secondly, before there was a prostituted woman, you can always be sure there was first a pimp. Pimps came first. And the other constraint is that we're grooming our women and girls in this patriarchal culture to become compliant or complicit victims. That's what consent is. It is a compliant victim, because when you have been told by this culture over and over again as a young woman or as a girl that the only thing that matters is how hot you are and how much sexual desire you can attract from men and how much you matter as a sexual object, when you are told over and over again that your only visibility is your capacity to sexually attract men, then of course what we have is a mass pop culture grooming girls en masse. So that also has to be added into a constraint. So when we talk about contracts, you know, what's so interesting is how many times you hear, well, she signed a contract. You know what? Men sign contracts all the time and rip them up. But somehow for a woman, if you sign a contract, it's got this kind of holiness attached to it. But when women do sign these so-called contracts in pornography, you get a list. Will you do double anal? Will you do gagging? Will you do and you just tick, tick, tick. Now, by the way, if you do not tick things like anal, double anal, strangulation, you know what? You're not going to get work. You're never going to get a job in the porn industry because they won't use you. And one of the things that's interesting that I read in Adult Video News, which is one of the major news sites of the porn industry, is they said, and this was from a director, he said on the first day of the set, check the issue, the sex acts she won't do, and just make her do one of them, because then you've broken her. So the whole goal of the pornographers on that first day, on that first scene, is to get her to go beyond what she said she would do. And in fact, once you're broken, as the pornographer says, you've got her for life. So this is the way it works. So I would argue for an informed consent contract, okay? So this is what it would look like. It's just imagine you're going in to have your appendix out or some surgery. You don't just get a contract that says sign here. You get an informed consent contract that tells you all the things that could happen during that operation. So I took that concept and I built an informed consent contract. So this is what it would look like. Do you agree to losing control of the most intimate images of your body? Do you agree to having limited to no recourse to have your images removed from porn sites? Your body will be exposed to millions of porn users who will view you as a slut, a whore, or worse. Do you agree to being attacked in the media by the porn industry and porn users as if you tried to sue the porn industry? And do you agree that living in fear that your loved ones, including your children, can see these images, and also your employees, because you leave a digital footprint that then makes it almost impossible for you to get a job? So what do we have to do? We have to basically shift the narrative away from this third wave faux feminism around empowerment, and come back to a concept of liberation, sisterhood, and activism. So one of the things I suggest is we go back to the basics of consciousness raising, where women-only space is used to discuss what it means to be a woman, what happens in this culture to you. And this was such a powerful way of galvanizing women in the second wave. We have to organize, organize, and organize. And that's not just online. It's not enough just to be doing it online. We need to get into the streets and disrupt the porn industry as much as possible. We need to speak truth to power. That means we have to talk, talk, and talk, because we have very little access to mainstream media. We have to absolutely refuse to collaborate with the patriarchy, And we have to misbehave in the most unladylike of ways, because well-behaved women rarely make history, or certainly they rarely make herstory. So what do we really, really want out of this? So we've often thought about society as a pie, and look how luscious that pie is. It looks delicious. Who wouldn't want the whole pie? So what's often happened is that people say, you know, feminists want all the pie. Well, not quite. Then they argue that feminists want half the pie. Well, first I just want to say, look how scrumptious that looks compared to how unappetizing that looks. So who wants half the pie? But that was the liberal feminist approach, was that, look, men have had all the pie, it's time to change it to half the pie. What do neoliberal feminists want? The crumbs. They're willing to settle for the crumbs that patriarchy throws at you, whether it's a tenured position, whether it's being really hot with the boys or whatever. It's whether being one of the boys in being a shill for the porn industry, then you get some brownie points. But the crumbs is what so many women are willing to settle on. What do we want as anti-porn feminists? We want to deconstruct the pie and rebuild it again from start to finish, because the pie is poisonous. Whoever eats from it gets poisoned. The pie was made within conditions of sexism, racism, capitalism, colonization. All of these things constituted the pie. So our job as feminists is to deconstruct the pie piece by piece and figure out where we're going to go, because we know what we don't want. We don't want the pie. So we owe this to our foremothers who went before us and put their lives on the line to change the world. We owe it to our sisters, and we owe it to our daughters. And you know what? We owe it to our sons, because they're not doing so great out of this either. So this is what women do. We mop up after men. We're very good at that. And now what we have to start doing is stop the mess in the first place. So I would argue that what we need to start thinking about is how we're going to shift the narrative away from the empowerment, because, you know, the feminism I joined always was about liberation. And what it meant that no matter how empowered I am, no matter how many class or race privilege I've got, not of course sex privileges, but class and race, it doesn't matter how empowered I am, because if my sister or my daughter over there is in any way suffering and exploited, then you know what? It is our job to walk mountains, cross mountains, to do whatever it takes to liberate all women. That is our goal, not the empowerment of a few. So today, one of the calls to action is that we have to start fighting in a way that is fierce. You know, Andrea Dworkin once said that what patriarchy does is it takes away the very thing women need to do to fight patriarchy, and that's courage. Well, you know what? I think the best thing we can do for Andrea, to remember her, is to actually say, Andrea, we found that courage. We found it, we're using it, and we're going to use every piece of it in order to fight for radical social change where women are no longer an oppressed class. That is how we are going to honor you, Andrea Dworkin.